In the winter of 1944, in a small German hospital near the Belgian border, a woman made a choice that could have ended her life. Her name was Sister Anna Hoffmann, and every night, while SS officers slept in the officers' wing above, she walked the darkened corridors of the basement, carrying bandages soaked in her own fear. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet. Each sound was a potential death sentence, because hidden in that basement, behind a false wall in the boiler room, were men who wore the wrong uniforms, Allied soldiers, enemy soldiers, men who, by every law of the Third Reich, should have been left to die or turned over for interrogation and execution. This is the story of a woman who chose compassion over country, humanity over hatred, and her own life over obedience. It is a story that remained buried for decades, told only in whispers by the men who survived and the few who knew her secret. It is a story of the impossible choices made in the dark heart of war, where a single act of mercy could be mistaken for treason, and where the line between hero and traitor was drawn not by nations, but by the quiet voice of conscience. The hospital in Manchow was unremarkable. A 3-story stone building with narrow windows that leaked cold air and walls that had witnessed too much death. By late 1944, the war had turned. Everyone knew it, though no one dared say it aloud. The Eastern Front was collapsing. Allied forces were pushing through France, and in places like Manchow, caught between retreating German forces and advancing American units. The machinery of war ground through human bodies with mechanical efficiency. The hospital treated German soldiers primarily, men pulled from the frozen Ardennes forests with frostbite, shrapnel wounds, and a 1,000-yard stare that came from watching friends die in the snow. Sister Anna was 31 years old. She had trained as a nurse in Berlin before the war, when medicine still felt like a calling rather than a political act. She was efficient, skilled, and quiet. The kind of woman who could set a broken bone while artillery shook the windows, who could hold a dying soldier's hand and tell him lies about going home. Her hands were always cold. She wore her blonde hair pinned severely back, and her uniform was always perfectly pressed despite the chaos. To the doctors, she was reliable. To the wounded soldiers, she was an angel. To the SS officers, who occasionally inspected the facility, she was invisible, which was exactly what she needed to be. It began in November, during the first heavy snow. American forces had been probing the German lines, and casualties came in waves. Among the wounded brought in one night was a group of men whose uniforms had been hastily stripped away. Civilians, the transport officer said, local men caught in crossfire. But Anna knew better. She had seen enough wounds to recognize the patterns. These men had been in combat. They had the wrong kind of injuries, the wrong kind of fear. And when she leaned close to check one man's breathing, he whispered in English, "Please." Just that one word, please. The German military doctrine was clear. Enemy combatants found behind lines were to be detained, interrogated, and in many cases, executed as spies. The hospital was obligated to report any suspected Allied soldiers immediately. Failure to do so was treason, punishable by death. Anna had seen the posters in town, the photographs of German citizens hanged for helping the enemy, their bodies left swinging in town squares as warnings. The message was unmistakable. Loyalty was survival. Compassion was weakness. Mercy was betrayal. Anna stood in the intake room that night, surrounded by moaning men and the copper smell of blood. and made a decision that defied every instinct for self-preservation. She told the attending physician these men were local civilians, confirmed the transport officer's story, and arranged for them to be placed in the basement recovery ward. It was a rarely used section, originally built as a tuberculosis ward in the 1920s, now serving as overflow space, cold, isolated, and importantly, visited only by Anna during her night rounds. There were 5 of them initially. 2 Americans, a British paratrooper, and 2 French resistance fighters who had been attached to an Allied intelligence unit. The American captain, a man named James Carrick from Pennsylvania, had taken shrapnel across his back. The British soldier, barely 20 years old, had a bullet lodged near his spine. The French fighters were in better shape, but needed somewhere to hide, while their wounds healed enough to attempt an escape. Anna examined them by candlelight that first night, her hands shaking so badly she could barely thread the suture needle. She spoke almost no English, they spoke almost no German. Yet somehow, in that dim basement, beneath the hospital where Nazi officers slept, an understanding formed. She brought them food stolen from the officers' supplies, bread, soup, morphine when she could steal it from the pharmacy. She changed their bandages with fabric torn from old sheets. She cleaned their wounds and whispered to them in German, words they could not understand, but whose tone conveyed everything. "You are not alone. You will not die here. Hold on." The British soldier, whose name was Thomas Winters, would later write in his memoir that Anna's face became his entire world during those weeks. She was the only thing standing between us and death. Not just death from our wounds, but death from discovery. Every time she descended those stairs, I thought it might be the last time I would see her. The routine became a careful choreography of deception. Anna worked double shifts, volunteering for night duty to ensure she was the only nurse in the basement ward. She falsified medical records, creating phantom patients to explain the supplies she requisitioned. She learned to forge the head physician's signature. When other staff asked about the basement ward, she described an outbreak of dysentery among local refugees, highly contagious, best left isolated. Fear of disease kept people away more effectively than locked doors. But deception on this scale could not last forever. The hospital was understaffed, resources were scarce, and attention to detail was a luxury no one could afford, which meant that mistakes were inevitable. The first close call came 3 weeks into the operation. An SS medical inspector arrived unannounced, conducting a facility audit. He wanted to see every ward, every supply closet, every patient record. Anna watched him descend the main staircase with 2 junior officers, his leather coat gleaming in the dim light, his face sharp and suspicious. She had perhaps 10 minutes before he reached the basement. She descended the back stairs at a run, her footsteps echoing in the narrow shaft. In the boiler room, she ripped aside the false wall. The 5 men were awake, sensing danger. She put her finger to her lips. "Sis," she whispered. "Inspection." Captain Carrick understood immediately. He began organizing the others, moving them deeper into the shadows. Behind the boiler itself, into a crawl space Anna had not even known existed. They worked in silence, wounded men dragging themselves across the concrete floor, biting back pain, leaving no trace. Anna replaced the false wall, her hands shaking, then grabbed a mop and bucket. When the inspector arrived, she was on her knees, scrubbing the floor, her face flushed with exertion. "This section is in use," the inspector asked, his voice cold. "For storage and sanitation." Hauptstürmpfer, Anna replied, not looking up. The isolation ward upstairs serves our current patient capacity. He walked through the room, his boots clicking on stone. He examined the walls, the corners, the shadows. He stood directly in front of the false wall for what felt like an eternity. Behind it, 5 men held their breath, barely 3 meters away. Thomas Winters would later describe the moment as hearing Death's footsteps pacing outside a door we could not lock. The inspector's hand touched the wall. Anna's vision narrowed. If he discovered them, they would all die. Not just the soldiers, her, the hospital staff who might have suspected, perhaps even patients accused of conspiracy. This wall sounds hollow, the inspector said. Anna forced herself to stand, to approach. The building is very old, sir. Many of the walls are deteriorating. We have requested materials for repairs, but materials are needed elsewhere, he finished. For the war effort. Yes, sir. He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes flat and calculating. Then he turned and walked away. The inspection concluded. The inspector left. And that night, when Anna returned to the basement, she found Captain Carrick sitting against the wall, his face white, tears streaming silently down his cheeks. "I thought we were dead," he whispered. "I thought you were dead." The Battle of the Bulge began in mid-December, Hitler's last desperate offensive through the Ardennes. The hospital was suddenly overwhelmed. Wounded poured in by the hundreds, German casualties from the ferocious fighting. Doctors worked 48-hour shifts, nurses collapsed from exhaustion. The basement ward could no longer be kept isolated. Additional staff were assigned. Anna's carefully constructed deception began to crumble. She moved the Allied soldiers, in the middle of the night, one by one, to an abandoned cellar beneath the hospital's east wing. It was not meant for human habitation. It was damp, freezing, full of rats. But it was the only space left to where they might remain hidden. The soldiers were weaker now, their wounds slow to heal without proper care. Captain Carrick had developed an infection. Thomas Winters could barely walk. The French fighters, the healthiest of the group, began planning an escape route, sketching maps on scraps of paper, whispering about reaching American lines 15 kilometers west. Anna knew they could not stay much longer. The hospital was being evacuated as Allied forces approached. Patients were being transferred to facilities deeper in Germany. Soon there would be nowhere to hide. She began stealing civilian clothes, collecting food and supplies for a journey. She knew that helping them escape was more dangerous than simply hiding them. It transformed her from passive concealer to active saboteur, but she had come too far. These men had faces now, names, stories. Captain Carrick had shown her photographs of his children. Thomas Winters had taught her English phrases. They were no longer enemy soldiers. They were human beings who trusted her with their lives. On the night of January 14, 1945, Anna made her final choice. She would help them escape. She forged travel documents, created a story about refugees being relocated, and arranged for a supply truck to carry them west toward the rapidly approaching American lines. The risk was absolute. If caught, there would be no trial, no mercy, just a rope or a bullet. She prepared everything in silence, working through the night, her hands steady now, fear replaced by a strange calm. This was what she had chosen. This was what she had become. But someone had been watching. One of the orderlies, a young man named Klaus, who had always seemed too eager to please, too interested in Anna's activities, had grown suspicious. On the morning of the planned escape, he reported his suspicions to the Gestapo office in the nearby town. By noon, 2 officers arrived at the hospital. They wanted to speak with Sister Anna Hoffman. They wanted to inspect the basement. They wanted answers. Anna was in the pharmacy when she heard them arrive. Through the window, she saw their black car, saw them enter the main building. She had, perhaps, 5 minutes, maybe less. She ran to the cellar, threw open the door. "They know," she gasped. "You have to go now." The soldiers scrambled to their feet. Captain Carrick grabbed her hand. "Come with us," he said. "They will kill you." Anna pulled away. "If I run, they will know for certain. If I stay, I can deny everything. You need time. Go now, please." The Allied soldiers escaped that day, slipping through the hospital's delivery entrance, while Anna stood in the administrator's office and calmly denied every accusation. She maintained her innocence with extraordinary composure. There were no hidden soldiers. The orderly was mistaken. She had been treating civilians, nothing more. The Gestapo officers searched the basement, found the abandoned cellar, found evidence that someone had been there. But the soldiers were gone. Without prisoners, without concrete proof, the case became complicated. Anna was arrested, nonetheless. Suspected treason was enough. She was held in a local jail while the investigation continued. For 3 weeks, she endured interrogation, threats, psychological pressure designed to break her. She never wavered. She admitted nothing. And then, in a stroke of fortune that seemed impossible, the war intervened. American forces broke through the German lines. The town was evacuated. In the chaos of retreat, Anna was simply released, forgotten in the scramble to escape the advancing army. She walked out of the jail on February 4, 1945, into a world on fire. She never returned to the hospital. She made her way west, became a refugee among millions, disappeared into the chaos of Germany's collapse. She survived the war, settled in a small town in Bavaria, never married, never spoke of what she had done. As far as official records showed, Sister Anna Hoffman was just another nurse who served during the war and faded into peacetime obscurity. For 40 years, the story remained buried, but the men she saved did not forget. Captain James Carrick returned to Pennsylvania, raised his children, built a life. Thomas Winters went back to England, became a teacher, wrote his memoirs. The French resistance fighters survived the war and carried the memory of the German nurse who risked everything. They tried to find her after the war, searching through displaced persons' records, writing letters to hospitals, following rumors. For decades, they found nothing. Finally, in 1985, a researcher investigating Allied escape networks during the war uncovered documents that led to Anna's location. She was 72 years old, living alone in a small apartment in Munich. When the survivors learned she was alive, they traveled to meet her. The reunion was filmed by a British documentary crew. Footage exists of the moment when Thomas Winters, now an elderly man, walked into Anna's apartment and saw her face for the first time in 40 years. They both wept. He took her hands, those hands that had saved his life, and said in broken German, "I never forgot. We never forgot." Anna died in 1989 at the age of 76. Her funeral was attended by 3 of the 5 men she saved and dozens of their family members, children who existed because Anna Hoffman chose mercy over fear, grandchildren who would never have been born if she had followed orders. At the service, Captain Carrick's son read a letter his father had written before his own death. In a war that demanded hatred, she chose love. In a time that commanded obedience, she chose conscience. She was not a soldier. She won no medals, but she was braver than any man I ever served with. She saved us not because we were her countrymen, but because we were a human. And in doing so, she saved something more important than our lives. She saved the possibility that even in humanity's darkest hour, goodness could survive. Today, Anna Hoffman's name is engraved on a memorial in Yad Vashem, among the righteous, among the nations. Honored not for dramatic heroism, but for quiet, daily courage. For the choice to see human beings where ideology demanded she see only enemies. Her story asks us a question that echoes across time. When everything demands that we choose sides, can we choose humanity instead? When loyalty and compassion conflict, which voice do we follow? Anna answered with her life. And in that answer she left us a legacy more powerful than any victory or defeat. She left us proof that even in hell there are angels, and sometimes they wear the enemy's uniform.